Hi everyone, today we're going to be painting the Yellow Mountains in China, also known as Huangshan, and this is based off of a photo that I took on a trip to China early last year. So before jumping into the painting, I did a value study just to design and organize the elements in the painting before jumping into color. I'll have the materials I used listed in the description box. For the paper, I'm using Strathmore Tone Tan Mixed Media paper, the 400 series. The brushes I'm using are a 3/4 inch flat brush, which comes to a really thin line, so it's really useful for precision. And then I've also got a size 8 round brush, both of them are synthetic. I also have a pencil, kneadable eraser, and a spray bottle. And for the drawing, I'm going to divide my paper up into eighths. As you can see, I halved it vertically, horizontally, and then halved it again. And I find that it can be very useful if you are someone that might struggle a little bit with the drawing, just to add in a few extra guidelines. And the real-time tutorial for this is on my Patreon page, so I go through everything in real time and you can paint along with me. In some parts of this tutorial on YouTube, I will speed things up just so this video is not too long. So to start off, I mixed some burnt umber and ultramarine blue, which just makes a neutral. If you mix it in equal proportions, you'll get a neutral kind of black, and if you add a bit more burnt umber, it'll be a bit warmer. If you add more ultramarine blue, it'll be a bit cooler. Then I just add a little bit of white to it, and I'm going to start blocking in the mountains that are closest to us. So my approach for this painting is to block in all of the paper as fast as possible so that I can start to judge the value relationships between all the different elements. And for the mountains that are closer to us, I'm making sure to keep them a darker value, and as I move back, I'm going to slowly add more white and more blue to fade it out into the color of the atmosphere. So far I'm just using ultramarine blue with burnt umber and white to lighten it. And if you look at the reference photo, you can see that the scene was very atmospheric, it was backlit, and it was a sunny day, so the colors are fading to the color of the atmosphere as they move back, which on this day meant that the colors were fading out to blue. You can see with the mountains on the left that I'm blocking in now, I am making them just slightly lighter in value, and the value study that I showed at the start of this video, I kept it in front of me while painting the color version, just so I could remind myself of the value structure and not to lose that while I was painting in color. What I'm also trying to do while keeping the value the same is shifting the color temperature within the same values. So you'll see I add a little bit of red or a little bit more blue. I am using some Venetian red in this painting, and I'm shifting the color temperature just slightly, but the important thing is that I'm maintaining that same value. And if you just squint down at your painting, you can assess the values of your painting. It's also very useful to squint down at your reference photo while blocking in, because it helps you to see the larger masses of values rather than all the little subtle changes. And you can see as I'm moving further back, I continue to add in more ultramarine blue with white. I also add in a little bit of red for warmth, and that red can be burnt umber, or it can be a Venetian red or a burnt sienna. Once I've blocked in the large masses of the mountain, I'm going to start blocking in the sky. And for the sky, I'm just using white with ultramarine blue and a little bit of red. And then I'm painting the very distant mountains, and I'm keeping that value shift between the sky and those distant mountains very, very subtle. I want them to read as basically one big value. And then I just continue to fill in all of the white of the paper, or in this case I'm using toned paper, so I'm just trying to block in all of the tone of the paper so that I can judge the value relationships against one another. And one thing you want to remember with gouache is that dark values will dry lighter, so don't be afraid to go a little bit darker than you think you need, because it will dry a little bit lighter, and you'll find that later as you start to adjust and fine-tune your values that is something that you're going to run into constantly. Now I'm also going to block in those distant mountains with a bluish green color. So I mix some yellow ochre with ultramarine blue and white, and I block those in the distance. You'll also notice that as things move back in space, the value difference between the light and the shadow grow closer and closer together. So the areas that I'm painting now, if you squint down at it, the values of the shadow and light are very, very close together. Now I've mixed up a little bit of yellow ochre and ultramarine blue with white, and I'm just placing in a little bit of the shadow values. As I come forward towards us, I'm adding in more ultramarine blue to darken the value and adding in those shadow shapes. Then I want to clean my brush off, and I'm going to work over the areas that are already blocked in. So at this stage I have blocked in everything, and so I can start to assess and fine-tune things. So I've mixed up burnt umber and ultramarine blue, I've added in some red, and I'm just adjusting the shapes as well as the values and the color temperature. And from here on out, it may seem like things start to slow down. At the start, the block in feels very quick and you see a lot of progress as the canvas gets covered, but as you continue on, it's all about fine-tuning and getting closer and closer to creating the finished painting, and things can really seem to slow down. Now I want to mix up some yellow ochre with ultramarine blue with a little bit of red, and I want to paint in the trees that are on the mountains. So they are the lighter pops of color on the mountain, and they help to convey where the light is coming from. And I'll just slightly adjust the color temperature again. If I want it to be cooler, just adding a little bit of blue, and if I want it to be warmer, a little bit more red and yellow, and just painting in those backlit trees. And again, I love this brush because of how much of a flat edge it comes to. It makes me feel like I don't need to switch to a smaller round brush in order to get into the smaller areas. You can see I'm kind of just tapping around and able to create these really thin lines. Also keep in mind that as you're painting the light shapes, when you move back in space, again you want to lighten the value. So I'm adding more white, and I'm also shifting the color temperature to the color of the atmosphere, which is blue in this case. So I'm adding in more ultramarine blue and white as I'm moving back in space, just like I was when I was painting in my shadow values. Because if I use the same color that I used for the trees on the foreground mountains and I put them in the background, they would be too dark and would look out of place in relationship to the shadow values in the distance. The value would be off and the color temperature would be off. So you are always shifting and controlling the value and temperature as you're moving back in space, and that's how you convey the atmospheric perspective and depth in a painting. Here I'm adding in a little bit more warmth. I'm adding in some yellow ochre and some red into the foreground trees. They're technically not in the foreground because they're still very far away from me in space as I'm looking down into this valley, but I call it foreground as it's the closest thing to us, one of the closest things to us as compared to all the trees in the very, very far distance. So I can add a little bit of warmth to them, but not too much. So I switched to a round brush and I just painted in a bit of that valley floor, making sure to again keep the value very similar to its surrounding areas, but just slightly lighter. I don't want to be adding pure white or anything there because that'll just be too white and too contrasty. And then the rest of the painting is just about fine-tuning and adding a little accents here and there. I often like to use my fingers to smudge out the gouache. If I lay down a mark and think that it's maybe a little bit too harsh, I'll just use my finger and smudge it out. And I switched between the round brush and flat brush just so I can get some different shapes every time I place down a mark. When I'm adjusting some of the darker values closer to me, I really want to remember that gouache dries lighter in the darker values. So I make myself go a little bit darker than I think I need so that when it dries, it doesn't dry too light. Otherwise, you'll find yourself reworking the same area over and over again, trying to match the value, which is a very tricky thing to do in gouache. And one of the last things I want to do is just paint in a couple of birds. So I've mixed ultramarine blue with burnt umber and white, and I'm just painting in some distant birds using the round brush so I can get that really fine tip. For the second bird that is lower, I've added in more white to show that it's a little bit further in distance and put a little bit more atmosphere between it and us. And then just a final few adjustments and tweaks and we are finished with this painting. So I hope you enjoyed painting along with me, and if you would like to follow along with the real-time tutorial, it is available on my Patreon page along with many other tutorials that I have on there, which I have been building for the last few years and have over 100 tutorials now. Thank you for watching and I hope to see you in a future video soon.